The stagecoach groaned like a dying animal, its wheels sinking into the half-frozen mud of Hemlock Ridge's main street. For 3 days, Eliza May had been tossed and rattled inside its cramped, musty interior, a parcel being delivered to a man she knew only from a single, sternly written letter. The Colorado Territory air that sliced through the window was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the deeper, colder smell of snow on the wind. It was a lonely smell, and it settled in her bones. When the door was finally pulled open, the man standing there was taller and harder than his photograph had suggested. Preacher Silas Blackwood was a pillar of salt-cured piety, his face a mask of sharp angles and hollows carved by a God more interested in judgment than mercy. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, swept over her without a flicker of warmth. He did not offer a hand. "You are Eliza May," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. He gripped her upper arm, his fingers digging into the thin wool of her traveling dress with a strength that felt like a brand. It was a claim of ownership, made before the half-dozen silent townspeople who had gathered to watch the bride arrive. His touch was cold, possessive, and it sent a tremor of pure animal fear through her. He pulled her from the coach, and she stumbled on the broken plank of the boardwalk. He did not steady her, only tightened his grip until a sharp pain shot up to her shoulder. "Mind your step, woman. Clumsiness is a sign of a distracted spirit." His voice was low and resonant, the kind that filled a church and made sinners tremble. In the open street, it was just menacing. She kept her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the muddy hem of her dress. She could feel the stares of the onlookers, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. No one moved to help. No one spoke a word. Hemlock Ridge was a town that had learned the hard lessons of minding its own business, especially where the preacher was concerned. He was their conduit to salvation, and they were not about to risk their souls for a mail-order bride with fear in her eyes. The wedding dress he provided was second-hand. Its lace yellowed with age. It smelled of camphor and regret. A woman from the church, her face pinched and joyless, helped her change in a small, cold room behind the mercantile. As the woman pulled the laces tight on the bodice, she saw the dark, blooming bruise on Eliza's arm where the preacher had held her. The woman's lips thinned, but she said nothing, tying the final bow with a sharp tug that stole Eliza's breath. The ceremony was a blur. The church was little more than a drafty wooden box, smelling of dust and unlit candles. The preacher's words were a monotone drone, promises of love and honor spoken with the emotional weight of a man reading a bill of lading. Eliza kept her eyes downcast, focusing on a loose floorboard near the altar. She recited her vows in a voice so faint it was nearly lost in the wind, whistling through the cracks in the walls. When he slid the thin, cold band of gold onto her finger, his hand was dry and rough, a dead thing. He did not lift her veil to kiss her. He simply turned, took her arm in that same bruising grip, and led his new wife from the house of God. Their new home was a small, severe-looking parsonage next to the church. It was impeccably clean, brutally ordered, and utterly devoid of comfort. There were no cushions on the hard wooden chairs, no curtains on the windows, no hint that anyone had ever laughed within its walls. A cold supper of bread and salted pork was laid out on the table. They ate in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, broken only by the scrape of his fork against the plate. He watched her, his gaze heavy and appraising, as if inspecting livestock he had just purchased. Eliza felt every swallow of food catch in her throat. She had spent her life being invisible, first in the orphanage where a quiet child was a forgotten child, and later in the scullery of a bustling brothel where the girls upstairs were commodities and the girls downstairs were less than ghosts. She had learned that silence and submission were the keys to survival. She had hoped this marriage, arranged through a notice in an Eastern paper, would be a different kind of servitude, perhaps one with a measure of peace. Looking at the man across the table, She knew that hope had been a fool's dream. That night, he showed her the true meaning of the vows she had taken. He taught her that the words to honor and obey were not suggestions but iron laws, and that her body was no longer her own. He was not a man of passion but of chilling, methodical correction, punishing sins she did not know she had committed. The violence was quiet, contained within the four walls of the bedroom, a sacrament of cruelty performed in the dark. When he was finished, he rolled away from her and fell into a deep, untroubled sleep, his breath rattling in the cold air. Eliza lay awake, a constellation of pain blooming across her skin. The world had shrunk to the size of this bed, this room, this suffocating darkness. For hours, she did not move, listening to the man's breathing and the lonely howl of the wind outside. A terrifying calm settled over her. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the floorboards beneath the bed, that she would not survive another night like this one. If she stayed, he would break her, piece by piece, until nothing was left but a hollow shell that cooked his meals and warmed his bed. Survival was an instinct drilled into her since birth. It was a desperate, clawing thing that had kept her alive in the orphanage and sane in the brothel kitchen. It rose in her now, sharp and clear. Slowly, silently, she slipped from the bed. The floor was icy against her bare feet. Every muscle screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, focusing on the single, burning thought of escape. She dressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her traveling clothes. She found her old, torn coat thrown in a corner and pulled it on. It was thin, offering little more than a memory of warmth. She knew she needed more than a coat. In the main room, a sliver of moonlight fell across the preacher's writing desk. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept towards it. He had mentioned keeping a pistol, a tool for protecting God's property from wolves, both four-legged and two. She pulled open the top drawer, the wood groaning softly, her breath hitched. Inside, nestled beside a leather-bound Bible, lay a Colt revolver. It was heavy in her hand, cold and alien. She had never held a gun before, but she knew it was a key. It was a voice for a woman who had none. She took the gun and a small handful of cartridges, tucking them deep into the pocket of her coat. The back door creaked as she opened it. A sound as loud as a gunshot in the still house. She froze, listening, but the preacher's heavy snoring continued, unabated. Then she was outside, the wind hitting her with the force of a physical blow. It tore at her hair and bit at her exposed skin, driving icy needles into her cheeks. The moon was a fractured shard behind fast-moving clouds. There was no road, no path, just the vast, swallowing darkness of the Colorado wilderness. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to go. She ran. She stumbled through the skeletal remains of an aspen grove, the bare branches clawing at her face and clothes. The thin leather of her shoes offered no protection from the sharp rocks and frozen ground. An hour in, a searing pain shot through her ankle as she twisted it in a hidden rut. She cried out, a small, choked sound that the wind snatched away. She got up and kept going, her run turning into a limping, desperate hobble. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her coat, her dress, stealing the feeling from her fingers and toes. Snow began to fall, not the gentle flakes of Christmas cards, but a hard, driving sleet that stung her eyes and turned the ground into a treacherous slurry. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white and gray. She had no sense of direction, no landmarks to guide her. There was only the driving need to put distance between herself and the parsonage, between herself and the man who slept in that bed. She did not know how long she walked. Hours bled into one another. The pain in her ankle became a dull, throbbing drumbeat that echoed through her entire body. The cold had numbed her beyond shivering. A thick, syrupy exhaustion began to cloud her mind, whispering to her, telling her to lie down, to rest in the soft, white blanket of the snow. It seemed like such a sweet, Simple idea, just to close her eyes for a moment. Through the blinding snow, she saw a dark line stretched across the white landscape. A fence. It was a sign of civilization, however small, a sign of life. With the last dregs of her strength, she staggered towards it, her hands outstretched. Her fingers brushed against the rough, splintered wood of a fence post, just as her legs gave out from under her. The world tilted, the white snow rushing up to meet her. And then there was only blackness. Cole Thatcher found her at dusk. He had been checking his fences before the storm settled in for good. A grim task he performed with the methodical, joyless efficiency that now defined his life. He saw the small, dark bundle crumpled against the post from 50 yards away. His first thought was that it was a calf, born too late in the season and lost to the cold. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself into something human. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder. The frontier did not reward carelessness, but the figure was perfectly still, already half dusted with a layer of fresh snow. It was a woman. Her face was turned away from him, her dark hair matted with snow and ice. She was wearing a tattered coat over a dress that seemed impossibly thin for this weather. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking in the cold. He brushed the snow from her face. She was young, her skin a ghostly white, her lips tinged with blue. For a moment, he thought she was dead. Then he saw the faintest mist of her breath ghosting in the frigid air. A flicker of something he had not felt in years, a sense of responsibility, stirred in the barren landscape of his heart. He had lost everything he had ever tried to protect: his brothers, his family's ranch, his faith in justice. He was a man who lived with ghosts, and he had no desire to add another to their ranks. With a grunt, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of twigs and cold fabric. The snow was coming down harder now, the wind a high, keening wail that promised a long and bitter night. He turned and headed back toward the distant, solitary light of his cabin, a small point of warmth in a vast, indifferent wilderness. He laid her down on the bearskin rug in front of the stone hearth, the only truly warm place in the cabin. The fire crackled and spat, casting flickering shadows across her still face. He worked quickly, his movements economical and practiced. He was a man accustomed to solitude and the practical demands of survival. He cut away her frozen, mud-caked boot with his hunting knife, revealing a badly swollen and discolored ankle. He stripped off her wet coat and saw the fine, dark fabric of her dress beneath. It seemed out of place in this rough-hewn world. As he worked, he discovered the other marks on her, the dark bruise on her arm, the faint red lines on her neck, half hidden by her collar. These were not injuries from a fall in the wilderness. These were man-made. He found the cold, heavy weight of the Colt in her coat pocket. He set it on the mantelpiece, well out of reach, his expression hardening. He had seen enough violence in his life to recognize its signature. He fetched a basin of warm water and a clean rag, washing the grime from her face and hands with a gentleness that felt foreign to his calloused fingers. He found a gash on her forehead, hidden beneath her hairline, and carefully cleaned it. He wrapped her ankle tightly with strips of linen. Finally, he covered her with a thick wool blanket, tucking it around her shoulders. She did not stir for the rest of the night, as the storm raged outside. He sat in his chair by the fire, watching her. He cleaned his rifle, oiled a saddle harness, and drank bitter, black coffee. But his eyes kept returning to the woman on his floor. She was a question he did not want to answer, a complication he could not afford. His life was stripped down to the bone: work, eat, sleep. He kept to himself, trading for supplies in town only when necessary. His interactions brief and surly. He had drawn a line around his world, and this woman had just stumbled across it. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in the brothel kitchen before the gray light of dawn. Then the full, aching weight of her body made itself known. Her ankle throbbed with a searing pain, and a dozen other, smaller aches echoed across her skin. She opened her eyes. She was not in the parsonage. She was in a small, rustic cabin, lying on a fur rug before a large stone fireplace. A warm, heavy blanket was tucked around her. The room was simple, masculine. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in one corner. A bed, neatly made, was pushed against the far wall. Shelves holding tins and jars lined another. And sitting at the table, a steaming mug cradled in his hands, was a man. He was watching her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She tried to scramble backwards, a choked gasp escaping her lips, but the movement sent a bolt of agony through her ankle. The man did not move from his chair. He just raised a hand, palm open, a gesture meant to soothe a spooked horse. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. "You are safe." Eliza's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, for a weapon. Her gaze fell on the mantelpiece, and she saw her pistol lying there. His eyes followed hers. "I took it from your coat," he said, his voice flat, without inflection. "Figured you would not be needing it in here." She stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was not a large man, but he was built of whipcord and weathered resolve. His face was lean, shadowed by a dark stubble, and etched with lines that spoke of hardship and loss. His eyes, a pale, clear gray, held a deep and abiding weariness. He looked at her not with hunger or malice, but with a kind of detached, clinical curiosity. She realized with a jolt that she was still in her dress, and the heavy blanket was tucked securely around her. He had tended to her, but he had not touched her. The realization did not calm the fear, but it shifted its shape. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy. "My name is Cole Thatcher. This is my homestead. Found you by my fence line last night. The storm has settled in. We will be snowed in for a few days, I reckon." He delivered the information in short, clipped sentences, as if reporting facts. Trapped, the word screamed in her mind. Trapped with another strange man in another isolated place. But this man was not the preacher. His silence was not the coiled, predatory silence she had come to know. It was the quiet of a man comfortable with his own solitude. He stood up, and she flinched instinctively, pulling the blanket tighter. He stopped, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He moved to the hearth, poured coffee from a pot into a second mug, and set it on the floor a few feet away from her, well out of his own reach. "It is black," he said, returning to his chair. "I do not have sugar." For 2 days, they existed in that small cabin, prisoners of the howling wind and the ceaseless snow. They moved around each other like wary animals, a silent, awkward ballet of shared space. He cooked their meals, venison stew and hard biscuits, and they ate in tense silence at the small table. He never sat directly across from her, always choosing the adjacent side, giving her space. He slept on the floor by the fire, leaving the bed for her. She refused it, curling up on the rug where she had woken, the warmth of the flames a comfort in the long, dark nights. She did not tell him her name or how she had come to be half dead in a snowstorm. He did not ask. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the storm, an unavoidable event to be weathered with stoic patience. He would leave for short periods to tend to his horse and a single milking goat in the small barn, returning with a dusting of snow on his shoulders, bringing the clean, sharp smell of the cold in with him. On the 3rd morning, the storm had lessened to a gentle fall of snow. Cole noticed the bandage on her wrist was coming loose. He had cleaned and dressed a deep scrape there, one she had gotten from a fall during her escape. "Let me see to that," he said, his voice quiet. He knelt in front of her, not too close, and gestured to her hand. Hesitantly, she extended her arm. Her entire body was rigid with tension. His fingers were surprisingly deft as he unwound the old bandage. They were rough and calloused from work, but his touch was light. impersonal. He cleaned the cut with a damp cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not look at her face, keeping his focus entirely on the task. The care he took, the sheer gentleness of the act, was so foreign it felt like a brand. It was a kindness she had no frame for, no defense against. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She spoke, her voice so low it was almost carried away by the crackle of the fire. "I am not used to gentle." Cole paused his work for a beat, his hand stilling over her wrist. He did not look up. The line of his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He resumed wrapping the fresh bandage, his movements as steady and precise as before. "Then I will just have to be stronger," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He tied off the bandage, gave her wrist a final pat, and stood up, turning his back to her as he walked over to the cabin's single window to look out at the unending white. Outside, far in the distance, obscured by the swirling snow, 3 riders moved slowly, their heads bowed against the wind. One of them dismounted, kneeling to examine the faint, snow-filled depressions in the ground. They were losing the trail, but they had not lost the scent, and they were not giving up. The snow stopped falling on the 4th day. It did not melt, but settled, a thick, pristine blanket that swallowed sound and reflected a brilliant, blinding light from the pale sun. The world outside the cabin was remade, scrubbed clean and silent. Inside, a different kind of thawing had begun, slow and painful. Eliza's ankle was a constant, throbbing reminder of her flight, but she refused to be idle. Idleness was a luxury she had never known, and it felt like a dangerous vulnerability now. She learned the rhythms of Cole's small homestead, inserting herself into them with a quiet determination that he did not question. In the gray light of dawn, she would limp out to the small, sturdy barn, the frigid air a shock to her lungs. There was a single horse, a stoic gelding named Buck, and a shaggy, brown milking goat with intelligent, amber eyes. The goat, Bess, took to her immediately. The act of milking was a comfort, the rhythmic pull and squeeze a familiar, mindless task, the warmth of the animal, the sweet, grassy smell of the milk hitting the bottom of the tin pail, was real. It was life. It anchored her to the present moment. She insisted on doing her share. She boiled water for washing, her hands turning red in the steam. She found his mending basket, a jumble of torn shirts and stray buttons. The needle felt good in her fingers. The simple act of pulling a tear closed feeling like a small victory against the chaos that had ripped her own life apart. As she worked the rough fabric of his shirt, the scent of lye soap rising from the cloth sent a shiver through her. Suddenly, she was no longer in the quiet cabin. She was 13 again. On the cold stone floor of the laundry room in Madame Dubois' establishment in St. Louis, her hands were raw, submerged in scalding, soapy water, scrubbing linens for the girls upstairs. The air was thick with steam and the sharp, chemical smell of lye, a smell that clung to the back of your throat. The madam, a woman whose smile never reached her cold, calculating eyes, would inspect her work with a critical gaze. A single missed stain meant no supper. 2 meant a slap that left her ears ringing for hours. In that kitchen, she learned that her worth was measured in clean plates and spotless laundry. She was a pair of hands, nothing more. To be seen, to be noticed, was to invite scrutiny and often pain. So she had made herself small, silent and efficient, a ghost in the background of other people's lives. The memory was so vivid that she flinched when Cole set a log on the fire, the sudden thud jarring her back to the present. He glanced at her, a question in his weary eyes, but she just shook her head and bent back over her sewing, her stitches suddenly tight and angry. She had been a ward of the state before that, passed from the orphanage to a series of increasingly grim workhouses. The orphanage was a cacophony of coughing, crying children and the sharp, impatient voices of the matrons. She learned there that love was a fairy tale and food was a battle. She remembered the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the fierce, desperate struggle for a crust of bread or a watered-down bowl of gruel. She learned to be quick and quiet, to eat fast before a bigger child could snatch her portion away. The matron saw the children not as souls to be nurtured, but as mouths to be fed and bodies to be clothed until they could be put to work. When the letter came from the preacher in the Colorado Territory, with its promise of a Christian home and a respectable life as a wife, the head matron had presented it as a divine salvation. "You are a fortunate girl, Eliza May," she had said, her voice devoid of any real warmth. "A man of God has chosen you. Do not disappoint him." They had packed her few belongings in a small valise, put her on the stagecoach with a ticket paid for by another, and sold her into bondage with a blessing. Cole, for his part, remained a fortress of solitude. He spoke when necessary, his words spare and practical. He kept his past locked away behind those clear, gray eyes. But the cabin was small, and the silence had a way of prying things loose. One night, the wind had died down completely, and the world outside was as still as a held breath. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of Eliza's needle through cloth. She sat on the rug, her back against a wooden crate, while he sat in his chair, sharpening his hunting knife on a wet stone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was hypnotic. He stopped, holding the blade up to the firelight, inspecting its edge. "My father built this hearth," he said, his voice quiet, directed more at the flames than at her. "Dragged every stone up from the creek bed himself. Said a home is not a home without a strong hearth, a place to gather." Eliza kept her eyes on her mending, but she was listening with every fiber of her being. "We gathered here," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "My parents, me and my two younger brothers, Thomas and Samuel. This was the only part of the main house that survived the fire." He set the knife and stone down on the floor beside him. "The railroad wanted our land. The main line was surveyed to come right through our valley. My father refused their offer. Said the Thatcher Ranch was not for sale at any price. They offered him less than half its worth." He picked up a poker and jabbed at the logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "The railroad men, they do not like the word no. They sent goons, men with hard faces and no souls. They tried to scare us off, shot some of our cattle, burned a hayrick. My father, he was a stubborn man. He and my mother went to town to see the marshal, to file a complaint. They left me in charge." His voice grew thick, the words coming out slower, heavier. "I was 18, Thomas was 15, and Sam was 12. They were good boys, full of life." He stared deep into the fire, his eyes seeing a different night, a different fire. "The goons came back that night. I was out in the far pasture, checking on a sick mare. I saw the glow from miles away. By the time I got back, the house was an inferno. The roof was gone. It sounded like a dragon roaring." He swallowed hard. "I tried to get in. The front door was blocked by a fallen beam. I could hear them screaming for me." He fell silent. The fire crackled, oblivious. Eliza had stopped sewing, her hands frozen in her lap, the needle still pinched between her fingers. She did not know what to say. There were no words for a thing like that. "The official report said it was a lantern, knocked over by accident," Cole said, his voice laced with a bitterness so profound it was almost a physical thing. "The marshal was on the railroad's payroll. Everyone was. My parents came back to a pile of ash and 2 graves. My mother, she never recovered. Wasted away within the year. My father sold what was left of the land to the railroad for pennies on the dollar and drank himself into the grave a year after that. I took my share and built this cabin, on this last piece of worthless land they did not want, right next to the ruins of the life they took from me." He looked over at her then, his eyes burning with a cold, dead fire. "The preacher in town, he told me it was God's will, that it was a test of my faith. I have not stepped inside a church since. I have not prayed in years. Justice is just a word men use to make themselves feel better about the evil they do." He stood up abruptly and went outside, closing the door softly behind him. Eliza did not move for a long time, the weight of his story settling over her. a sorrow that was so vast it seemed to make the small cabin even smaller. She finally understood the deep, weary sadness in his eyes. He was a man haunted by ghosts, just as she was. The next morning, a fragile truce had been woven in the silence. They did not speak of what he had shared, but it lay between them, a shared understanding of loss. Cole was trying to shave, using a small, cracked piece of a mirror propped against the wall. The light was poor, and he nicked himself under the chin, cursing softly. He was a man whose hands were made for axes and ropes, not the delicate work of a straight razor. Eliza watched him for a moment. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she spoke. "I can help with that, if you like." He turned, his face half lathered with soap, a look of surprise on his face. "In the place I worked before," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I used to shave the old man who owned the kitchens. His hands shook too much to do it himself." Cole hesitated for a long second, his gaze searching her face. It was an act of immense trust he was considering, to put a blade to his own throat in the hands of a stranger. But he saw no deception in her eyes, only a quiet offer. He gave a single curt nod and sat down in the chair. Her hands trembled as she took the razor from him. She filled a bowl with hot water from the kettle, her movements slow and deliberate. She lathered the brush and gently applied the warm foam to his face, her touch as light as a feather. She could feel the heat of his skin, see the pulse beating in his throat. The air was thick with a tension that was different from before. It was not fear, but a raw, terrifying intimacy. She put the razor to his cheek, her breath held tight in her chest. She worked slowly, carefully, scraping away the dark stubble to reveal the clean line of his jaw beneath. Their hands brushed as she steadied his chin, and a jolt went through her. An involuntary, full-body flinch. The preacher's hands, his cold, cruel touch, the memory was seared into her skin. She pulled her hand back as if burned. The razor wavered. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice tight. Cole did not move. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, his eyes closed, and waited. He waited for the tremor to pass, for her breathing to steady. His stillness was a gift, a silent acknowledgement of her fear that gave her the space to overcome it. After a long moment, she took a deep, shaky breath and brought her hand back to his face. This time, she did not flinch. She finished the shave in silence, her movements becoming more confident, more certain. When she was done, she wiped the last of the soap from his face with a warm, damp cloth. He opened his eyes. He looked younger. The hard lines of his face softened. He reached up and touched his smooth chin, his calloused fingers tracing the path the razor had taken. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes besides weariness. It was a flicker of gratitude, raw and unguarded. He said nothing, but he did not have to. That night, the ghosts came for her. She was back in the parsonage, the air cold and still. The preacher stood over her, his face a mask of righteous fury, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. His voice boomed, filling the small space, accusing her of sins she did not understand. His shadow fell over her, vast and suffocating, and his hand reached for her. She cried out, a muffled, desperate sound, thrashing against the blankets on the hearth. In the darkness, Cole came awake instantly. He sat up, his hand going for the rifle that was always beside him. He saw her, tangled in the blankets, her face contorted in the grip of a nightmare. He heard her whimper. "No, please." He started to get up, to go to her, to shake her awake, but he stopped. He remembered her flinch when he had only brushed her hand. To wake her now with his touch might be to trade one terror for another. He was a stranger, a man, and men were the source of her pain. So he stayed where he was, a silent guardian in the dark, and waited for the nightmare to release its hold. After a few moments, her thrashing subsided, and she fell back into a troubled, but deeper. Sleep. He watched her for a long time before lying back down. But he did not sleep. When Eliza woke, the sun was streaming through the window. The cabin was empty. For a terrifying second, she thought he had left her. Then she saw it. On the floor beside her rug was a steaming mug of black coffee and another thick wool blanket, neatly folded. He had heard her. He had known she was afraid. And he had offered comfort in the only way he knew how, from a safe and respectful distance. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee. The sound of hoofbeats outside sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. It was a heavy tread, more than one horse. Cole came in through the door just as a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. His face was grim. "Get in the root cellar," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Now, do not make a sound." He pointed to a trap door she had not noticed, hidden beneath a bearskin rug. She did not hesitate, scrambling into the small, dark space, the smell of damp earth and potatoes filling her nostrils. Cole pulled the rug back over the door just as the knock came again, louder this time. She heard Cole's heavy boots cross the floor, the sound of the latch being lifted. "Sheriff?" Cole's voice was flat. "Thatcher," another voice replied, deeper and tinged with authority. "Mind if I come in? It is cold enough to freeze the devil's tears out here." "Suit yourself. Miller." The door closed, and the footsteps of two men crossed the floor above her. Through a crack between the floorboards, she could see them. Cole, and a big, barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache and a silver star pinned to his thick coat. "Just doing my rounds," the sheriff said, warming his hands by the fire. "The preacher's new wife ran off a few nights back. You have not seen anyone strange out this way, have you? A young woman, on her own?" Eliza's heart stopped. "No one," Cole said without a moment's hesitation. The lie was as smooth and solid as a river stone. "Just me in the snow." The sheriff grunted, looking around the small cabin. "He is putting up a hell of a reward for her. $500. $500? It was a fortune, enough to buy a man a new life. "Says she tried to kill him in his sleep," the sheriff continued, oblivious to the silent, terrified woman beneath his feet. "Took off with his pistol and all the church collection money. He has put out wanted posters from here to Denver. Attempted murder and theft. He wants her back, one way or another." Attempted murder, theft. The words were blows, stealing the air from her lungs. It was not enough that he had hurt her. He was going to destroy her, to paint her as a monster, a whore, a killer. His power reached far beyond the walls of that parsonage. "Well," the sheriff said, clapping his hands together, "if you see anything, you let me know. A reward that big brings out the bounty hunters. We do not want that kind of trouble around Hemlock Ridge." "I will keep an eye out," Cole said, his voice unchanging. She heard them walk to the door. A few more pleasantries exchanged. And then, the sheriff was gone. A moment later, the trapdoor was lifted. Cole looked down at her, his face unreadable. He offered her a hand, and she took it, her own hand trembling as he pulled her up into the light. She stood before him, shaking, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. She was a wanted woman, a fugitive with a price on her head. "He will not stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He will send men. He will find me." Cole was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the wanted poster he had seen in town, the one the sheriff had so conveniently described. The crude drawing looked nothing like her, but the words were damning. Finally, he spoke. "You cannot stay here," he said, his voice flat and hard. "It is not safe, for either of us. In the morning, I will give you buck and enough supplies to get you over the pass. You can head north, lose yourself in the territories." It was an offer of escape. It was also a dismissal. A wave of despair washed over her, so profound it made her knees weak. He was right. She was a danger to him. She had brought this trouble to his door, and he owed her nothing. But the thought of being alone again, of facing that vast, unforgiving wilderness with a price on her head, was a terror beyond imagining. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I will not survive alone," she whispered, the admission a raw, painful truth. Then she straightened her shoulders, a flicker of her own stubborn pride surfacing. "But I will not drag you down either. You have lost enough. I will leave." He looked at her, at the fear and the fight warring in her eyes, at the woman who had faced down her own ghosts to offer him a moment of comfort with a razor. He saw the bruises on her soul, so much like his own. He thought of his brothers, of his failure to protect them. He had been running from that failure for years, hiding in his solitude. But hiding was not living. "You are not dragging me," he said, his voice quiet but firm, the hardness gone. "You are reminding me what it means to protect something again." He turned and looked out the window. The bright, clean snow was marred. Near the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows of the pines, was a single, deep set of boot tracks. Someone had been there, watching the cabin, and they were not the sheriff's. The boot tracks were a declaration of war. Cole saw them not as a mere trespass, but as a violation of the fragile peace he had built around himself, and the even more fragile safety he had offered the woman sleeping by his hearth. The silence of his homestead had been broken. He said nothing to Eliza, but a new tension coiled in his gut, tight and cold. He spent the day cleaning his rifle and her pistol with a meticulous, focused intensity. He checked the stock of ammunition, his movements economical and grim. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a sentinel. Night fell like a shroud, thick and starless. The wind picked up again, a low moan that rattled the single window pane in its frame. They ate their meal of salted pork and beans in a silence that was heavier than before. It was no longer the quiet of two strangers learning each other's space, but the tense, listening silence of prey. Eliza felt it too. She watched Cole's eyes dart to the window, his hand never far from the rifle he had propped against the table. The fear she had been holding at bay came creeping back, a cold tide rising in her chest. They were banking the fire for the night when the world exploded. The window didn't just break. It disintegrated inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. The gunshot that caused it a deafening cannon boom inside the small cabin. Eliza screamed, throwing herself to the floor, her hands flying up to cover her head. Cole didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed and grace that was terrifying, grabbing the rifle from the table in one fluid motion and kicking the heavy table onto its side. "Get behind it!" he roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. Another shot tore through the thin wall of the cabin, the bullet thudding into the log just above her head, showering her with splinters. She scrambled behind the makeshift barricade, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. Cole was already at the side of the shattered window, hunkered low, peering into the darkness. "How many?" she choked out. "3, maybe 4, he said, his voice a low, steady growl. "Spread out. They are not amateurs." A voice called out from the darkness, rough and confident. "Thatcher, we know you are in there, and we know you have the girl. The preacher wants her back. Send her out, and we will let you live to see the sunrise." Cole didn't answer. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired into the night, aiming at the muzzle flash of the next shot. A grunt of pain from the darkness told him he had found his mark. It was not a killing shot, but it was a message. "They will not let me live," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "You know they will not." "No," Cole said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They will not." He fired again, then ducked as 2 bullets ripped through the space where his head had been. They were pinned. The bounty hunters were patient, content to pick them apart from the safety of the trees. The cabin was a trap, a coffin. "The root cellar?" Cole said, his voice urgent. "The back wall is stone. It leads out to the base of the ridge. It is a tight crawl, but it will get us out of here. They will see us. Not if I give them something else to look at. He grabbed a half-empty bottle of kerosene from a shelf. He pulled a rag from the mending basket, stuffed it into the neck, and soaked it. Then he looked at her, his gray eyes clear and hard in the flickering firelight. When you get to the barn, you saddle Buck. Do not wait for me. You ride. You follow the creek up into the canyon. There is an old trail on the east wall. It will take you over the ridge. You do not stop for anything. You understand? She stared at him, horrified. I am not leaving you. That is an order, he snarled, his face a mask of cold fury that she knew was born of desperation. You are the one they want. Without you, they have no reason to stay. Now go! He lit the rag with a burning splinter from the hearth. As Eliza scrambled to the trap door and lifted it, he ran, low and fast, to the back of the cabin. He kicked open the heavy rear door and hurled the flaming bottle into a pile of dry firewood stacked against the barn. It erupted in a whoosh of orange flame, the sudden light painting the snowy landscape in hellish colors. The men outside shouted in surprise, their attention drawn to the sudden blaze. It was the chance he needed. As Eliza disappeared into the cellar, Cole fired 2 more quick shots toward the trees before ducking back and diving through the trapdoor after her, pulling it shut just as a volley of bullets stitched a pattern across the cabin floor. The crawlspace was a narrow, suffocating tunnel of dirt and rock. It smelled of damp earth and fear. They moved on their hands and knees, Cole pushing her from behind, the sounds of shouting and gunfire fading above them. They emerged behind the cabin, shielded by the rocky ridge. The barn was now fully engulfed in flames, a roaring pyre that lit up the night and cast dancing, monstrous shadows. The bounty hunters were distracted, their dark figures silhouetted against the fire. There was no time for Buck. This way, Cole hissed, grabbing her hand. His grip was firm, not cruel, a lifeline in the chaos. He pulled her along the base of the ridge, into the deep shadows where the firelight could not reach. They ran, Eliza's ankles screaming in protest, her lungs burning with the effort. They plunged into the dark maw of the canyon, the sound of the creek, a rushing roar beside them. They did not look back. For 2 days, they moved deeper into the mountains, following game trails and ridges that only Cole seemed to know. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving host. The wind was a constant, keening presence, slicing through their thin coats and stealing the warmth from their bodies. Their food was a handful of dried jerky and hard biscuits that Cole had stuffed into his pockets before the attack. It was not enough. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in their bellies. On the second night, they found it, an abandoned mining shack, clinging to the side of a steep, pine-choked hill. It was little more than a skeletal frame of rotting timbers, its roof half collapsed. It looked like the ribs of some great, dead animal, but it was shelter. Inside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the walls. A rusty, broken wood stove stood in one corner, a single, derelict cot in the other. It was bleak, but it was better than the open snow. Cole, with a grim efficiency, managed to patch a section of the roof with loose boards and pack the worst of the cracks in the walls with mud and pine needles. He found a few dry pieces of wood under the cot and, using his flint and steel, managed to coax a small, smoky fire to life in the belly of the rusty stove. The warmth it offered was meager, but it was enough to keep the bitter cold at bay. That night, as they huddled together near the stove, sharing the last strip of jerky, they heard the wolves. Their howls echoed through the canyon, a lonely, predatory sound that seemed to creep right through the walls of the shack. Eliza shivered, pulling her thin coat tighter. Cole laid another piece of wood on the fire, the flare of light pushing the shadows back for a moment. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They were fugitives, stripped of everything, with only each other and a fire that seemed determined to die. In the crucible of that isolation, something began to shift between them. The polite distance of the cabin was gone, burned away with the barn. Here, survival depended on a raw, unspoken partnership. He would leave for hours, returning with a rabbit or a squirrel snared from the woods, his face etched with cold and exhaustion. She would have the fire going, would skin the meager game with his hunting knife, her movements becoming less hesitant, more sure. She learned to read the signs in his face, to know when his weariness was a bone-deep thing that required silence, and when the tension in his shoulders could be eased by a hot cup of pine needle tea. He, in turn, began to see past the frightened creature he had pulled from the snow. He saw a resilience in her that was as hard and unyielding as the mountain rock. He saw the way she pushed through the pain in her ankle without complaint, the way her hands, though trembling, were steady when she reloaded the pistol he had given back to her. One afternoon, he returned to the shack to find her sitting on the floor, painstakingly sharpening a stick with a shard of rock. "What are you doing?" he asked. She looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Making a spit," she said, her voice practical. "In case you actually managed to catch something bigger than my fist today." A strange, rusty sound came from his throat. It took Eliza a moment to realize he was laughing. It was not a full-throated laugh, but a short, sharp bark of surprise. The sound was so unexpected it startled a smile from her in return. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, a small, hesitant curve of her lips that lit her face from within. The moment was fleeting, but it left a warmth in the cold air long after it had passed. The trust between them grew in these small, quiet moments. But with trust came a new kind of tension. They were a man and a woman, alone, pressed together by circumstance. At night, they slept huddled together on the single cot for warmth, a universe of space between their bodies, neither one willing to bridge the gap. The proximity was a sweet kind of torture, a constant awareness of the other's breath, the heat of their skin, the unspoken needs that lay buried beneath layers of trauma and grief. One night, the wind was particularly brutal, shaking the small shack as if it meant to tear it from the mountainside. The fire was low, the shadows deep and menacing. Eliza was staring into the flames, her face a portrait of old sorrows. "I am ashamed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and dark. Cole turned to look at her. "Ashamed of what?" "Of what he did to me," she said, not looking at him. "Of what I let him do. It feels like a stain, like I am soiled. I ain't what you deserve." The last words were choked, thick with self-loathing. She had carried this feeling with her since she was a girl in the brothel kitchen, listening to the whispers, knowing that to be a woman in this world was to be constantly at risk of being spoiled, used, and discarded. Cole moved closer, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He reached out and gently took her wrist, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. His touch was warm, steady. It was not a touch of possession or demand, but of quiet affirmation. She flinched, a ghost of a reaction, but did not pull away. "I was not looking for a saint." "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I have seen what this world does to people, to good people. I don't need something perfect. I just want something real." His words, simple and direct, were a key turning a lock deep inside her. The shame, the fear, the years of enforced silence and submission. It all came rushing to the surface. The emotional dam that had held her together for so long did not just crack, it shattered. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure, undiluted pain. Tears she had refused to shed for years streamed down her face. Cole did not shush her or offer empty comforts. He simply pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her as she wept, her small body shaking against his. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, letting her pour out all the poison she had held inside for so long. He held her like she was something precious, something worth protecting. When the storm of tears finally subsided, she was left trembling in his arms, exhausted and empty. She looked up at him, her face swollen, her eyes red. The space between them was charged, filled with everything that had just been broken open. He looked down at her, his own eyes filled with a fierce, aching tenderness. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was raw and trembling and desperate. It was a kiss of shared wounds and mutual survival. It tasted of wood smoke and desperation and a sorrow so deep it had no name. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his shirt, kissing him back with a ferocity that surprised them both. It was a kiss that was not about desire, but about a profound, soul-deep need to feel alive, to feel human, to feel seen. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The air in the shack seemed to hum. He looked at her, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. There was a question in his eyes, a desire that was now unmistakable, but there was also a deep, abiding respect. He saw the fear that still lingered in her gaze, the shadow of the past. That night, they did not make love. Instead, he pulled the thin blanket around both of them, and they lay on the narrow cot, holding each other. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. He held her as if he were trying to piece together something that had been broken, both in her and in himself. It was a different kind of intimacy, a quiet promise that healing did not have to happen all at once. For the first time in her life, Eliza felt safe in the arms of a man. The next day, the world felt new. The air was cleaner, the light brighter. A fragile hope had taken root in the desolate shack. While Cole was checking a line of snares, Eliza was foraging for firewood near a pile of old mining debris a short distance from the cabin. Her eyes caught a glint of metal, half buried in the dirt and rock. Curious, she dug it out. It was a locket, made of silver, now tarnished and dented. It was broken, the hinge sprung. She opened it. Inside, protected from the elements, was a small, faded photograph. It showed two young boys, no older than 15 and 12, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. They were grinning, their faces full of the kind of unadulterated, reckless joy that only the young possess. There was a strong family resemblance to the weary, haunted man in the shack. When Cole returned, she held it out to him. "I found this." He took the locket from her, his face going pale. He stared at the photograph, his thumb gently tracing the outlines of the boys' faces. "Thomas and Samuel," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. He turned the locket over in his hand. One side was blackened, charred by an intense heat. He looked at her, and this time, he did not hold back. He told her everything. He told her about the fire, about the sound of their screams, about the hatred that had been his only companion for so long. He spoke of the guilt that ate at him, the feeling that he, as the older brother, had failed in his one sacred duty to protect them. He confessed that he saw their faces every time he closed his eyes. Eliza listened in silence, her heart aching for him, for the boy he had been and the man that grief had forged. She did not offer words of comfort, knowing they would be inadequate. When he finally fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the cold mountain air, she reached out and gently touched the charred edge of the locket he still held in his palm. "We can still carry what we lost," she whispered, her voice soft but sure. "Even if we can't fix it." He looked from the locket to her face, a flicker of understanding, of release, in his eyes. He had shared the heaviest part of his soul, and she had not turned away. She had simply helped him hold it. The moment was one of profound, silent communion. Two broken souls finding a strange kind of peace in their shared damage. The sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, shattering the stillness. It was followed, a second later, by a high, piercing whistle. Cole was on his feet in an instant, pulling her down behind a rocky outcrop, his rifle in his hand. His face was a mask of stone. The hunters had found them. The shot was the sound of a world ending. For a heartbeat, there was only the sharp crack in the echo, a violent punctuation to the morning's quiet. Then came the whistle, high and sharp, a signal from one predator to another. They had been sleeping in shifts, a habit born of necessity, and Cole was on his feet before the echo had fully died, pulling Eliza from the cot and shoving her toward the back of the shack. "They are here," he said, his voice a low, hard command. It was not a statement of fear, but of fact. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the cracks in the walls, a treacherous, revealing light. Another shot rang out, this one splintering the rotting wood of the doorframe. They were testing the defenses, finding their range. "Stay down," Cole ordered, creeping to a narrow gap in the wall, his rifle ready. "There are 3 of them, one in the rocks to the east, 2 coming up the trail." Eliza huddled behind the cold, rusty stove, her pistol clutched in her hands, its weight a poor comfort. She could hear them now, the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground, the low murmur of their voices. They were confident, unhurried. They had them trapped. The shack, which had been their shelter, was now their tomb. "Thatcher!" The same rough voice from the cabin shouted up the hill. "We know you are in there. You made this a lot harder than it needed to be. The preacher is a patient man, but his patience has a price. Send out the girl now, and he might let you bleed out quick." Cole answered with a blast from his rifle. The shot aimed not at the man's voice, but at the cluster of rocks to the east. A curse and the clang of a bullet striking stone was his reply. He had their attention. A moment later, a coordinated volley of gunfire erupted from all 3 directions, tearing through the flimsy walls of the shack. Wood splintered. Dust and debris filled the air. Eliza pressed herself against the floor, making herself as small as possible. The world reduced to a terrifying chaos of noise and violence. Cole fired back, a methodical, disciplined rhythm of shoot, move, reload. He was a good fighter, she realized, calm and focused in the face of death. But he was 1 man against 3. The odds were long, and getting shorter with every bullet they fired. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the gunfire, a wet, choked gasp. She looked over and saw Cole slump against the wall, his rifle clattering to the floor. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his left shoulder, blossoming like a fatal flower on the rough fabric of his shirt. "Cole!" she screamed, the name torn from her throat. "I am all right," he grunted, his face pale and beaded with sweat as he tried to push himself up with his good arm. "Just winged." But she could see the lie in his eyes, the shock and the pain he was trying to hide. He reached for the rifle, his fingers fumbling. The men outside must have seen him fall. They let out a triumphant whoop. "Got one!" the voice shouted. "He is hit! Let's move in! Finish this!" They were coming. Eliza could hear their boots pounding closer up the trail. Cole was struggling to his knees, trying to lift the heavy rifle with 1 arm, his face a mask of agony. They would be on them in seconds. In that moment, something inside Eliza snapped. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a white-hot, protective rage. He had saved her. He had lied for her. He had held her while she wept. The time for cowering was over. Her eyes darted around the small, disintegrating shack. Above them, the half-collapsed roof was supported by a series of thick, rough-hewn rafters. It was a desperate, insane idea, but it was the only one she had. "Cover me," she said, her voice sharp and clear. Cole looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but registering the new, hard resolve in her face. He managed a grim nod, pulling the pistol from his belt and steadying it on his knee, aiming toward the door. Eliza scrambled onto the rickety cot, its legs groaning in protest. From there, She pulled herself up, her fingers digging into the rough, splintery wood of the rafters. Her wounded ankles screamed as she put weight on it, but she ignored the pain. She hauled herself up into the dusty, shadow-filled space. Cole's rifle clutched in one hand. She lay flat on a wide, sturdy beam, her heart pounding against the wood, and looked down. Through a gap in the roof, she could see them. 2 men were advancing on the front of the shack, rifles held at the ready. The third was providing cover from the rocks. They were moving slowly, cautiously, like wolves circling a wounded deer. She rested the barrel of Cole's rifle on an adjacent beam, trying to steady it. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely see through the sights. She had never fired a rifle before. She thought of Cole, bleeding on the floor below her. She thought of the preacher's cold, cruel hands. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pressed the stock of the rifle hard against her shoulder, aimed at the center of the biggest man, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her, a brutal, jarring force that nearly knocked her from the beam. The sound was deafening. Down below, one of the men cried out and staggered back, clutching his leg. He was not dead, but he was down. His partner stared up at the roof in stunned disbelief, his face a perfect picture of shock. It was the opening Cole needed. A single shot from his pistol cracked from inside the shack, and the second man crumpled to the ground. The third man, the one in the rocks, fired a wild shot toward the roof and then, seeing he was alone, turned and fled, disappearing back down the trail. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded man and the harsh, ragged sound of Eliza's own breathing. She scrambled down from the rafters, her body trembling with adrenaline and shock. Cole was slumped against the wall, his pistol on the floor beside him, his eyes closed. For a terrible moment, she thought he was dead. "Cole," she whispered, touching his face. His eyes fluttered open. A weak, pained smile touched his lips. "Good shot," he rasped. They had to move. The third man would be back, and likely with reinforcements. They had no food, little ammunition, and Cole was losing blood. She helped him to his feet, his full weight leaning heavily against her. Every step was an agony for him. They left the shack and its dead and wounded without a backward glance, plunging once more into the unforgiving wilderness. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, a slow, stumbling nightmare. Eliza was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Hemlock Ridge. She was a raw nerve of pure survival instinct. She found a thick branch to use as a crutch for Cole, half carrying him through thorny brush and down steep, rocky inclines. They waded through an icy creek to hide their trail, the frigid water a shocking, numbing pain. Cole was fading, his initial strength giving way to a feverish haze. He mumbled the names of his brothers, his head lolling against her shoulder. She kept him moving, her voice a constant, low murmur of encouragement, promising him rest, promising him safety, promises she had no idea if she could keep. That night, they found shelter in a shallow cave, barely an overhang in the rock. Cole collapsed, his body shaking with chills despite the fever burning his skin. His wound was a mess of torn flesh and dried blood, the area around it swollen and hot to the touch. It was infected. If she did not clean it, he would die. With a grim resolve, she built a small, sputtering fire. She tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat and took out Cole's hunting knife. Her hands shook as she held the blade in the flames, the metal glowing a dull red. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. "Cole, this is going to hurt," she said softly, though she did not know if he could hear her. "You have to stay still." She took a deep breath, the smell of seared metal filling her nostrils. Then she set to work. By the flickering, uncertain light of the fire, she probed the wound, her stomach churning as she dug out the lead ball. Cole cried out, a low, guttural sound of pure agony, his body arching in her arms. But he did not fight her. When the bullet was out, she poured the last of the whiskey from his flask over the wound. He screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed in the small cave, and then he passed out. She found a needle and thread in his possibles bag. Her hands were still trembling, covered in his blood, but her gaze was unwavering. She heated the needle in the fire and began to stitch the torn flesh back together. Her stitches were clumsy, uneven, a testament to her terror, but she did not stop. With each pull of the thread, she felt as if she were stitching a piece of her own broken soul back together. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound with the last of the clean cloth she had and collapsed beside him, utterly spent. He was still alive in the morning. The fever had not broken, but it had not worsened. She got him to drink some water and then set out, following the cryptic, fever-induced directions he had given her. The hidden mesa, Levi, find Levi. It took them another full day of torturous travel. She followed a dry riverbed until it ended at a sheer rock wall that seemed to be a dead end. Despair began to set in. Then she saw it, a narrow trail, almost invisible, winding its way up the side of the cliff face. With the last of her strength, she hauled Cole up the treacherous path. At the top, the world opened up. It was a wide, flat mesa, a natural fortress hidden from the world below, dotted with scrub pine and hardy grass. A small, rough-hewn settlement was nestled in its center, a collection of dugouts, tents, and a few small cabins. A thin plume of smoke rose from a central fire. It was a place of refuge. A man emerged from the largest cabin as they approached. He was huge, a mountain of a man with a wild, graying beard and a long buffalo coat that looked as old and weathered as he was. He held a massive rifle in the crook of his arm, as if it were an extension of his body. His eyes, small and sharp under a heavy brow, took in the sight of them. A bleeding, delirious man being held up by a blood-stained, half-starved woman. "Levi?" Eliza asked, her voice a dry croak. The big man's eyes narrowed. First at Cole, a flicker of recognition in his gaze, and then at her. He stared at her face for a long, hard moment. His hand moved from his rifle to the hilt of a large skinning knife at his belt. "I know you," he rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "I saw your face on a poster in Dusty Creek. The preacher's wife. There is a bounty on your head." Eliza's heart sank. They had come all this way only to be turned over to the very men they were fleeing. But she was too tired to run anymore. She looked this mountain of a man in the eye, her own gaze fierce and desperate. "The poster is a lie," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "The bounty is a lie. That preacher, he is not a man of God. He is a monster hiding behind a Bible. He did this to me." She gestured to the faint bruises still visible on her neck. "And he did this to Cole when he tried to help me. Please, he will die if he does not get help." Levi stared at her, his expression unreadable. He had seen 1,000 liars in his lifetime. He had hunted men and beasts across the plains, and he knew the look of desperation, but he also saw something else in her eyes, a hard, unshakable truth. He looked at Cole's still form, at the blood, at the sheer, brutal cost of their journey. "I have seen more sin in a prayer meeting than I ever did on the plains," he finally said, a grim pronouncement. He spat on the ground. "Bring him inside." The settlement on the mesa was a sanctuary for the lost and the broken. Levi, a man who had seen the great buffalo herd slaughtered and the wild plains tamed and fenced, had created a refuge for those who, like him, had been pushed to the edges of the world. It was a place for fugitives, for women fleeing brutal husbands, for orphans with nowhere else to go. They were a small, silent community of ghosts and survivors, and they took Eliza and Cole in without question. A woman named Sarah, whose face was a roadmap of a hard life, helped Eliza tend to Cole's wound. She clucked her tongue at Eliza's clumsy stitches, but admitted they had likely saved his life. For days, Cole drifted in a fever dream while Eliza sat by his side, bathing his face, forcing broth between his lips, and whispering to him. telling him he was safe, that he had to fight. Slowly, he began to heal, and as he did, Eliza began to find a new purpose. She was no longer just a survivor. She helped Sarah care for the other women, some of whom had wounds far deeper than Cole's. She held a young girl who woke screaming from nightmares. She learned to grind corn, to set snares, to contribute to the small, fragile community. For the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. She was not a possession, or a servant, or a fugitive. She was just Eliza, a woman with capable hands and a heart that was slowly, painfully, learning to mend. Just as Cole was getting his strength back, a bitter winter storm swept down from the mountains, trapping them all on the mesa. The wind howled for days, piling snow in deep drifts against the doors of the dugouts. Once again, they were forced into close quarters. But this time, it was different. The fear and uncertainty were gone, replaced by a deep, quiet intimacy that had been forged in blood and fire. One night, they sat together in their small dugout, the only light coming from a single tallow candle. Cole was watching her, his gaze intense. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers tracing the scars on her knuckles. "You saved my life, Eliza," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he could not hide. "You saved mine first," she whispered. The space between them crackled. He leaned in, and this time, when he kissed her, it was not with the desperation of their last kiss, but with a slow, aching tenderness that spoke of gratitude and a deep, profound reverence. It was an unspoken question, and she answered by kissing him back, her body melting against his. That night, they made love for the first time. It was a slow, deliberate discovery of each other's bodies, of each other's scars. It was not rushed. It was not violent. There was a gentleness in his touch that she had never known, a patience that allowed her to open up to him without fear. It was a sacrament, a quiet, solemn act of two halves of a broken thing finding a way to be whole again. It was healing. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the warm buffalo robes, the sound of the wind a distant lullaby. Eliza rested her head on his good shoulder, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. A fragile peace had settled in her heart, but the fear was not entirely gone. It was a ghost that had haunted her for too long. "I do not know how to live without being afraid," she confessed into the darkness, the words a raw and honest admission. He was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled her closer, his arms a circle of strength around her. "Then we learn together," he answered, his voice a steady anchor in the dark. "One day at a time." The storm passed, and, a week later, Levi returned from a scouting trip, his face grimmer than usual. He found Cole and Eliza sitting outside their dugout, enjoying the weak winter sun. "I have news," he said, his voice low. "From a friend down in Hemlock Ridge. Your preacher is not a man who gives up. He has bribed the circuit judge and the marshal. He is leading a posse himself, not of bounty hunters, but of righteous men from his congregation. They are painting you as a murderous whore and a thief. Eliza, they mean to see you hang." A cold dread washed over Eliza. She could see them, their faces filled with judgment, their Bibles in one hand and their ropes in the other. Cole stood up, his face set like granite. The weariness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard fire. Then we stopped running. "What are you talking about?" Eliza said, grabbing his arm. "We cannot go back there. They will kill us." "They will kill us if we keep hiding," Cole countered, his voice firm. "This does not end until we end it. We go back to Hemlock Ridge. We go before that judge, and we tell them the truth." "The truth?" she cried, her voice rising in panic. "The truth does not matter to men like that. They will not listen to me." He turned and gripped her shoulders, his gaze boring into hers. "Maybe not, but they will listen to me, and they will listen to Levi, and they will listen to every decent person we can find who is sick of living in fear of a man like him." He looked out over the vast, wild landscape, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. I am tired of hiding. Eliza, I have been hiding from the world since my family died. No more. This time, we fight back, with truth. The journey back to Hemlock Ridge was a descent into the lion's den. They did not ride openly, but traveled in the back of a freight wagon driven by a tight-lipped acquaintance of Levy's, a man who asked no questions and offered no opinions. They were hidden amongst barrels of salted fish and sacks of flour, the stench of which clung to their clothes. Eliza wore a drab, borrowed dress and a deep bonnet that shadowed her face, turning her into a nameless, faceless woman. Cole, his arm in a sling beneath a dusty duster, looked like any other worn-down ranch hand looking for work. The disguise was thin, but it was all they had. As the wagon rumbled down the town's main street, Eliza felt a suffocating wave of dread. This was the place her hope had come to die. Every building, every face, was a reminder of her humiliation and terror. The parsonage stood beside the church, severe and silent, a monument to her private hell. She could feel the town's judgment like a physical weight, a veneer of piety stretched thin over a core of fearful conformity. She saw the wanted poster, her crudely drawn face plastered to the wall of the mercantile, the words thief and attempted murder stark and brutal beneath it. Her stomach churned. They disembarked at the edge of town and slipped into the shadows of an alleyway. "Arthur Vance," Cole said, his voice a low whisper. "He has an office above the land surveyor. He is a good man, as good as a lawyer can be. Anyway, I will go see him, find out the lay of the land." He looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "You should not be seen on the street." "There is someone I have to see," Eliza said, a new, steely resolve in her voice. "Martha Jessup, the midwife. Her cabin is just north of here, by the creek." Cole hesitated, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "Is that wise?" "When I first arrived," Eliza explained, "before the wedding, the preacher sent me to help her. A woman was in hard labor. The baby was turned wrong. Martha's hands were old and tired. I helped her turn the child. We saved them both." She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "She is a woman who values life, and she is a woman who keeps her own counsel. If there is an ally for me in this town, it is her." He saw the strength in her, the purpose. It was the same strength that had stitched his shoulder and fired a rifle from a rafter. He gave a single, reluctant nod. "Be careful," he breathed, and then he was gone, melting into the twilight. Martha Jessup's cabin smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, a comforting, earthy scent. The midwife was a small, wiry woman with hands as gnarled as ancient roots and eyes that had seen the beginning and end of countless lives. She opened the door a crack, her face a mask of suspicion. Then her eyes widened in recognition. She pulled Eliza inside and bolted the door behind her. "Child," she hissed, her voice a dry rustle. "They are saying terrible things about you. The preacher has been whipping this town into a frenzy. He speaks of you as if you were Jezebel herself." "Every word he speaks is a lie, Martha," Eliza said, her voice trembling but firm. Martha looked at her, a long, appraising gaze that seemed to peer right into her soul. She saw the exhaustion, the fear, but also the hard-won strength that had not been there before. She saw the ghost of the bruises on Eliza's neck. "I know," the old woman said softly. "I saw his mark on you the day you arrived. I have seen that same mark on too many wives in this town." She poured Eliza a cup of chamomile tea, her movements brisk and practical. "You were brave to run. What do you need from me?" "I need people to know the truth," Eliza said. "I cannot be the only woman he has hurt." Martha's lips thinned into a hard line. "No, child, you are not the only one. But fear is a powerful gag. He holds their souls in his hands, or so they believe." She patted Eliza's hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "But whispers have a power of their own. I will talk to the women, I will plant the seeds, but you be careful. The ground here is poisoned." Meanwhile, Cole found Arthur Vance in his cramped, dusty office, a man drowning in a sea of paper. Vance was a portly, balding man with kind, tired eyes, a man who believed in the law even when he knew it was a losing game. He listened to Cole's story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each word. "This is bad, Cole," he said when Cole had finished, rubbing his face with his hands. "Preacher Blackwood has Judge Abernathy in his pocket. Abernathy is a weak man, more concerned with his reputation and his comfort than with justice. The preacher has been building a case against this woman, painting her as a temptress and a thief. He has witnesses who will swear they saw her with the collection money." "They are liars," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "Of course they are," Vance sighed. "But in a courtroom, a well-dressed lie often shouts down a ragged truth. Our only chance is a public hearing. We demand the judge hear her testimony before he signs a warrant. We make it a spectacle. We force the town to look this thing in the face. It is a long shot, Cole, a damned long shot." For 2 days, Hemlock Ridge simmered. It was a town at war with itself. The battle fought not with guns, but with whispers and sideways glances. In the Mercantile, a group of the preacher's most devout followers, grim-faced women in severe bonnets, spoke loudly of the harlot who had tried to murder their spiritual leader. But in the quiet corners, in the laundry rooms and over backyard fences, Martha's whispers were taking root. Women who had long suffered in silence, who had hidden their own bruises and borne their own secret shames, began to look at each other with a new, questioning light. They had all seen Eliza on her wedding day, the fear in her downcast eyes. The preacher's story, so loud and righteous, was beginning to show cracks. The hearing was held in the town's largest building, the general store. The space was cleared, and benches were brought in. It was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, nervous sweat, and cheap tobacco. It was not a formal courtroom, but a makeshift arena where a woman's life would be decided. Eliza sat at a small table beside Cole and Arthur Vance. She was trembling, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Across the room, Preacher Blackwood sat with his own counsel, his face a mask of serene, pious injury. He looked at her once, his eyes cold and full of a chilling certainty. He believed he had already won. Judge Abernathy presided, a flustered, sweating man who clearly wished he were anywhere else. He mumbled some legal jargon, his voice barely audible over the shuffling of the crowd. The preacher's lawyer spoke first, a slick, well-dressed man from Denver, who painted a lurid picture of Eliza as a cunning seductress who had preyed upon a grieving man of God, attempting to murder him for the church's money. Then it was Eliza's turn. Arthur Vance stood and simply said, "We call Eliza May Thatcher to speak for herself." A murmur went through the crowd. Eliza felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare. She felt Cole's hand find hers under the table, his grip warm and steady. It was an anchor in a raging sea. She stood up, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. She looked out at the faces of the town, at the hard, judging eyes and the few, scattered sparks of sympathy. She took a deep breath. "My name is Eliza May," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. She cleared her throat and started again, louder this time. "My name is Eliza May. I came to this town to be the wife of Preacher Blackwood. I came here hoping for a safe home, for a life of peace." She paused, her gaze finding the preacher's. His face was unmoving, a stone carving of righteousness. "That is not what I found," she said, her voice gaining strength. "From the moment I stepped off that stagecoach, he treated me not as a wife, but as a piece of property he had purchased. He was a cruel man in private, a man whose hands were hard and whose words were like stones." A woman in the front row gasped. The preacher's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection! Slanderous accusations!" "Let her speak," Judge Abernathy said wearily, waving him back down. Eliza's voice grew stronger, fueled by the truth she had held inside for so long. She did not speak of the worst of the violence, not in detail. She did not have the words for it, and she knew they would not be able to hear it. Instead, she spoke of the fear. She spoke of the cold silence, the bruising grip on her arm, the way he looked at her as if she were dirt beneath his feet. She spoke of that final, terrible night, and the certainty that she would not survive another. "I did not try to kill him," she said, her voice ringing with a desperate clarity. "I ran for my life. I took his pistol because I was afraid he would come after me. I took nothing else. I ran into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back and a terror in my heart that no amount of money could ever create." She stood there, her testimony finished, her soul laid bare for all to see. The room was utterly silent. No one moved, no one breathed. She had given them her truth. It was all she had. Judge Abernathy cleared his throat, shuffling the papers in front of him. He would not meet her eyes. He glanced nervously at Preacher Blackwood, who gave him a look of pure, cold command. The judge was a puppet, and his strings were being pulled. "While this testimony is moving," the judge began, his voice weak and apologetic, "it does not constitute proof. There is no evidence to refute the claims of theft, and the charge of attempted murder is a serious one. In the absence of corroborating witnesses, I find that I have no choice but to—" The main door of the mercantile creaked open, swinging inward with a gust of cold air. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, was Levi. He was a giant, a figure from a wilder, older time, his presence filling the room and sucking the air out of it. And he was not alone. Behind him, standing in the street, were 4 women from the refuge, their faces weathered and scarred, but their eyes clear and resolute. One of them was Sarah. Another was a young woman with a haunted look who Eliza recognized from the mesa, a woman who had never spoken a word. Levi strode into the room, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, a sound like a hammer of judgment. He stopped in front of the judge's table. "You are looking for witnesses, Judge," he boomed, his voice silencing the whispers that had broken out. "Then look no further." He gestured to the women behind him. "These women have all sought shelter with me, and they all have one thing in common. They are all running from the righteous touch of a man of God." He pointed a thick, uncompromising finger at Blackwood. This woman, Mary Sutter, was a member of his congregation in Leadville before he came here. Ask her about his private Bible lessons. The preacher's face, for the first time, lost its serene composure. A flicker of pure, animal panic crossed his features. He shot to his feet. "Lies! These are harlots and madwomen! This is a conspiracy orchestrated by the devil himself!" But it was too late. The seed of doubt that Eliza had planted had been watered. The sight of those 4 silent, accusing women was more powerful than any sermon. The carefully constructed facade of Preacher Blackwood was crumbling, revealing the rotten core beneath. The whispers in the crowd were louder now, angry, questioning. Judge Abernathy looked from the preacher to Levi to the silent women and then back to Eliza. The pressure had shifted. The fear of the town was beginning to outweigh the fear of the preacher. He slammed his gavel down on the table. "Silence!" he shouted. He took a deep breath, a man making a decision for himself for the first time in years. "I find no cause to issue a warrant for the arrest of Eliza May Thatcher. The charges of theft and attempted murder are dismissed. This hearing is adjourned." A collective gasp went through the room. For a moment, there was just stunned silence. Then, a few people started to clap. Cole squeezed Eliza's hand, a look of fierce, triumphant pride in his eyes. It was over. She was free. Then, chaos erupted. Preacher Blackwood let out a roar of pure, unholy rage. The mask of piety did not just slip. It was utterly consumed by the monster it had been hiding. His face was contorted, his eyes bulging with a murderous light. This was not a man of God losing his flock. This was a predator losing his prey. With a guttural scream, he lunged, not at the judge, not at Levi, but at Eliza. He moved with a terrifying speed, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from inside his coat. He was on her before anyone could react. Cole shouted her name, shoving the table aside to get to her. But he was too far. The preacher's arm was raised, the blade of the knife glinting in the lamplight, ready to plunge into her heart. The crack of the Colt was a single, definitive sound that cut through the screams. It was not loud or messy. It was brutally efficient. A neat, dark hole appeared in the center of Preacher Blackwood's forehead. His eyes went wide with a final, ultimate surprise. The knife clattered to the floor, and then he collapsed, a dead weight, at Eliza's feet. Cole stood with the pistol still smoking in his hand, his body a shield between Eliza and the dead man, his face a grim, stony mask. For a moment, the entire town was frozen. Then the spell broke, and the room descended into pandemonium. Women screamed, men shouted, some people scrambled for the doors, while others surged forward to get a better look at the body. The town had not just witnessed a killing. It had seen its own dark, secret heart exposed and executed on the floor of the general store. The town marshal, a man named Miller, who had been standing uselessly in the back of the room, finally pushed his way through the crowd, his own gun drawn. He looked at the dead preacher, at the knife on the floor, and then at Cole, his face a mixture of fear and reluctant duty. "Cole," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you have to give me the gun." "It was self-defense." "Marshal," Arthur Vance said, stepping forward. "You saw it. Everyone saw it. He was going to kill her." "I know what I saw," Miller said, his eyes darting nervously to the faces of the preacher's devout followers, who were now staring at Cole with the looks of pure hatred. "But a man is dead. The preacher is dead. I have to arrest you, Cole. It is the law." Cole looked at Eliza. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a new, more terrible kind of horror. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had damned himself. He slowly, deliberately, placed the pistol on the table and held out his hands. They locked him in the town's small, cold jailhouse, a single stone cell with a barred door. The chaos of the hearing spilled out into the street, splitting the town in two. One side, led by the preacher's acolytes, called Cole a murderer, a godless killer who had gunned down a holy man. The other side, the quiet, whispering side, now finding its voice, called him a hero. Eliza refused to leave. She pulled a bench up to the bars of his cell and sat there as night fell, ignoring the marshal's pleas for her to go home. There was no home to go to. Her home was now on the wrong side of a set of iron bars. Through the window, they could hear the angry shouts of a crowd gathering in the street, their voices fueled by whiskey and righteous fury. They were calling for a rope. They were calling for a lynching. Cole sat on the edge of the hard cot, his head in his hands. He had traded her freedom for his own. "You should go, Eliza," he said, his voice muffled. "It is not safe for you out there." She reached through the bars and touched his hair. He looked up, his face a landscape of despair. She leaned forward, pressing her lips to the cold iron, as close to him as she could get. She kissed him through the bars. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice fierce with a love that had been forged in the crucible of absolute terror. "Now let me save you." The morning of the trial dawned cold and unforgiving. A thin gray light filtered through the grimy window of the marshal's office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, the town of Hemlock Ridge held its breath. It was a town perched on the edge of a knife, ready to fall on the side of justice or on the side of the mob. Eliza had not slept. She had spent the night on the hard bench outside Cole's cell, her hand resting on the cold iron bars, a silent vigil against the darkness. The angry shouts from the street had eventually died down, replaced by a tense, simmering silence that was somehow more menacing. She and Cole had spoken little. their presence a comfort that words could not have improved. They had faced death together in the mountains. They would face this together, too. When Marshal Miller arrived with a plate of greasy bacon and stale biscuits, his face was pale and drawn. "The judge is convening at 10 o'clock, he said, avoiding their eyes. "The whole town will be there. I have tried to keep order, but the preacher's friends are stirred up. Be careful, Cole." "It is not my safety I am worried about," Cole said, his gaze fixed on Eliza. As they were led from the jailhouse to the general store, the street was lined with people. It was a gauntlet of stairs. The faces were a study in the soul of a small town. The openly hostile, their mouths twisted in judgment. The fearful, who looked away as they passed, not wanting to be seen choosing a side. The morbidly curious, hungry for the spectacle of a man's downfall. But then Eliza saw another group, clustered near the entrance to the store. It was the women. Martha Jessup stood at their head, her small frame as unbending as an old oak. Beside her was Mary Sutter, the woman from Leadville, and the other women from the refuge, and behind them were others, wives and daughters of Hemlock Ridge, women Eliza had never spoken to, but who now looked at her with a quiet, fierce solidarity in their eyes. They did not shout or jeer. They simply stood and watched and waited. Their silence was a weapon. The general store was even more crowded than before. It felt like a powder keg, the air thick with tension. Judge Abernathy sat at his makeshift bench, looking even more miserable than he had at the hearing. The trial was a formality, a thin veneer of law stretched over a chasm of raw, communal fury. The preacher's lawyer, the slick man from Denver, was gone. In his place stood a local rancher named Jedediah Stone, a hard, humorless man who had been Blackwood's staunchest supporter. He was not a lawyer, but he did not need to be. His purpose was not to argue the law, but to channel the town's rage. The proceedings began, a grim farce of justice. Stone called witnesses who swore Cole Thatcher was a godless troublemaker, a man known for his violent temper. They twisted his solitude into misanthropy, his grief into a simmering rage that had finally boiled over. They spoke of the sanctity of the preacher's life, of the blasphemy of his murder in a public place. Cole sat stoic and silent through it all, his face a mask of stone. When it was Arthur Vance's turn, he did not call Cole to the stand. Instead, he stood and faced the crowd. "There is only one defense that matters in this case," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "And that is the truth, a truth that many in this town have been too afraid to speak. I call Martha Jessup to the stand." A murmur rippled through the room. Martha walked to the front, her back straight, her steps steady. She did not look at the judge or the lawyers. She looked at the women of the town. She spoke in a clear, unwavering voice, not of the shooting, but of the day Eliza arrived. She described the bruise on the young bride's arm, the terror in her eyes. "I have been a midwife in this territory for 40 years, she said, her voice crackling with authority. "I know the difference between a clumsy fall and the mark of a man's hand. What I saw on that girl was the mark of a brute." Jedediah Stone leaped to his feet. "This is irrelevant. The woman is not on trial here." "Is she not?" Vance countered. "Her character has been dragged through the mud to justify the actions of a so-called man of God. The context of this killing is everything." The judge, seeing the determined faces of the women in the crowd, reluctantly agreed. "Proceed," he mumbled. Vance proceeded. He called Mary Sutter, who spoke of the preacher's time in Leadville, of the young women in his flock he had preyed upon, using his power and their faith to trap them, discarding them when he was done. Then he called another woman, a member of Hemlock Ridge's own congregation, a woman who had always been one of the preacher's most fervent supporters. She came forward, trembling, her husband glaring at her from the crowd. She spoke in a choked whisper, telling of the private consultations in the parsonage. of the preacher's hands that strayed, of his words that twisted scripture into a tool of shame and control. She wept as she spoke, the tears of a woman finally unburdening herself of a secret that had been poisoning her soul for years. One by one, they came forward. Not all of them had been victims of the preacher's worst impulses, but they had all been victims of the fear he cultivated. They spoke of his cruelty, his greed, the way he used the collection plate to enrich himself while others struggled, the way he wielded guilt and damnation like a whip to keep his congregation in line. The picture they painted was not of a martyred saint, but of a petty, vicious tyrant who had wrapped himself in a cloak of piety. With each testimony, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The angry, self-righteous certainty of the preacher's supporters began to waver, replaced by a confused, troubled silence. The truth, once spoken, was a contagion, spreading from one heart to another, burning away the lies. Finally, Vance rested his case. He had put the entire town on trial, and it had been found wanting. Judge Abernathy looked out at the faces before him. They were no longer the faces of a mob, but of a community in the painful throes of a moral reckoning. He could see that to convict Cole Thatcher now would not be an act of justice, but a declaration that the suffering of these women did not matter. He could no longer hide behind the law. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking but clear. "In light of the testimony presented here today," he announced, his gaze sweeping across the room, "it is the finding of this court that Cole Thatcher acted to defend the life of an innocent woman from a clear and present danger. The act was justifiable. The charges are dropped. Mr. Thatcher, you are a free man." For a moment, the room was silent, the verdict hanging in the air. Then, a wave of sound washed over them. Cheers, sobs of relief, the shuffling of 100 people rising to their feet. Eliza threw her arms around Cole, burying her face in his chest, the tension of the past days finally breaking, leaving her weak and trembling. He held her tight, his one good arm a circle of iron around her. But the battle was not over. As they stepped out of the general store and into the cold light of day, they were met by the hard, hateful faces of Jedediah Stone and a dozen other men. These were the preacher's loyalists, the men whose own petty tyrannies had been validated by his. They were not interested in the truth. They were interested in vengeance. They held axe handles and thick lengths of rope. "That is not justice in there," Stone snarled, his face flushed with rage. "That is the chattering of hens. We will have a real reckoning, right here." The crowd recoiled, a space clearing around the two opposing groups. Marshall Miller stood frozen, his hand on his gun, hopelessly outnumbered. Then something remarkable happened. Martha Jessup stepped forward, her small, frail body planting itself directly between Cole and Jedediah Stone. Then Mary Sutter stood beside her. Then the woman who had wept on the stand, one by one. The women of Hemlock Ridge, the same women who had just found their voices, formed a human wall, a shield of calico and worn wool, around Eliza and Cole. Their faces were afraid, but they were resolute. They would not be silent anymore. The men in the crowd, the husbands and fathers and brothers, looked at the line of women, at their own wives and daughters standing in defiance, and a flicker of shame, of decency, stirred in them. A few of them stepped forward, not to join Stone's mob, but to stand behind the women, their faces grim and determined. The standoff was absolute, a silent war of wills fought in the muddy Main Street. Into that silence, Eliza moved. She gently detached herself from Cole's embrace and walked forward, her head held high. She did not walk around the line of women, but through it, until she was standing alone, facing Jedediah Stone and his mob. She was not the trembling, downcast creature who had arrived in this town months ago. Her eyes were clear and hard as agate. She looked at Stone and at the men behind him, and she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the still, cold air, a voice of pure, unbending steel. "No man owns me now," she said, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of her new life. "And no man ever will again." The finality in her voice was absolute. It was not a plea or a threat. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a sovereign soul. Jedediah Stone looked into her eyes and saw not a victim he could intimidate, but a woman he could not break. The rage in his face faltered, replaced by a grudging, resentful confusion. He spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and motioned for his men to back away. The mob, its conviction broken, dissolved. The men slinking away into the alleyways and saloons, their moment of righteous fury lost. That day marked a turning point, not just for Eliza and Cole, but for Hemlock Ridge. The town began to change. Slowly, painfully. The silence that had protected the preacher had been broken, and in its place, conversations began. The women who had spoken at the trial had unlocked something in themselves and in each other, a shared strength that could not be put back in its box. Cole had no desire to stay on the land that held so many ghosts. The following spring, he sold what was left of his family's ruined ranch to a young couple just starting out. With the money, he bought a quiet, secluded homestead at the base of a canyon miles from town, a place with good water and rich soil, a place where a man could build a future instead of living in the past. Eliza did not settle into a quiet life as a rancher's wife. She had found a purpose on Levi's Mesa, and she brought it with her, with Cole's help, and with donations from the women in town and a surprising, anonymous contribution left on the judge's desk. She built a school. It was not a proper schoolhouse, just a sturdy, one-room cabin. But it was a beacon. It was a school for the girls of the territory, for the orphans and the outcasts, the ones for whom the world had few good plans. She taught them to read and write, to do sums, but she also taught them other things. She taught them that their voices mattered, that their bodies were their own, and that their spirits were not a thing to be broken by any man. She taught them how to be strong. One night, years later, they sat before the hearth in their new home. The fire roared, a warm and comforting presence, holding the vast, dark wilderness at bay. Outside, a million stars glittered in a sky that was wide and wild. A peace had settled between them, a deep, comfortable silence born of shared trials and a love that had been tested in fire. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand interlaced with his. The scars were still there. A faint, silvery line was visible on his shoulder if you looked closely, and in her eyes, if you looked even closer, there was still a shadow, a memory of a fear that would never entirely disappear. But they were not defined by their scars anymore. She looked into the flames, at the life she had built from the ashes of another. "I never thought I could love someone this way," she whispered, the words a quiet marvel. Cole turned his head and kissed the top of hers. "Then we will keep surprising each other," he answered, his voice a low, gentle rumble. They sat in silence, their hands clasped together, watching the flames dance. The dark sky above them was immense, filled with the promise of tomorrow. The scars remained, but so did the love. Gentle, fierce, stronger. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans of the West. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.